Good evening, everyone. Welcome, dear Gültekin.
Greetings, everyone. I hope my internet connection will stay strong this evening.
Let's hope so. I know that you watched the last week's recording. Would you like to say something about the passages I read last week?
Well, I couldn't help you last week, but yes, I watched the recording and saw that you shared very good examples. For me, the major association in my mind regarding the passages you read last week was about the controlled connections or communications. I thought that these are actually a part of the existing system of the whole existence, because in the whole human body, as well as the systems given as examples, there is a cybernetic approach. Cybernetics is the transdisciplinary study of circular processes, like feedback systems where outputs are also inputs. And actually, cybernetics takes on the example of the human body. For example, the balancing insulin ratio in our bloodstream or perspiration mechanism. These are in such control systems involving circular processes. When we get too warm, we sweat, and the perspiration over our skin evaporates and our body cools down. And this feedback, or the cool down is complete message, goes to our brain, and the process of perspiration gets stopped. So, in circular systems like our body has and is, before the output is activated, it is used as an input to check the process by backtracking it with feedback. That is, the final product is checked at its source. So, we see the same mechanism, the same precaution that working perfectly within this whole system. Just like you read in the passages last week, the influences or messages that are sent to the higher consciousness of the being, before they arrive at the related centers in the medium's brain, had to send back to the being or beings in duty sending these influences, to check if the intended message would arrive intact or not at the intended centers. Yes, I wanted to mention that.
I would like to remind our dear friends to watch the previous week's video before watching this one, because the last week's topic will continue to be elaborated in the pages we will read this evening. Actually, it is always better to watch the whole series, starting from the first video, because concepts and topics follow each other in an ever-widening spiral in this book.
Another point I'd like to share is, there was a Brazilian medium named Luiz Antonio Gasparetto. He passed away in 2018. He was well known in Brazil and Europe for mediumistic paintings. He was painting with closed eyes or as blindfolded. His method was very interesting, without any comprehension or awareness on his part. And when it comes to the spiritual art, there is a distinction between inspiration and mediumship. Gasparetto's was mediumship, and I'd like to point out that when we say a medium's comprehending the influences he or she conveys, please know that this comprehension may be at a level of awareness, but not the all levels of meanings of the influences sent. But some mediums may do this. Some mediums can comprehend all levels of meanings of the influences sent. For example, during a spiritual communiqué from the Plan of the Faithful, it is said that the medium, that is, our dear master Mr. Erikdal, was comprehending all the meanings of the messages given during this work. Still, I wanted to make it clear that when we read or hear, as it is said in this passage, that in most of the communiques, this activity occurs with comprehension. It does not necessarily mean that the medium comprehends all when out of trance. The medium just notices that a process of conveying is done by him or her.
Thank you for pointing to this distinction. Because there are many types of mediums, when you look at their personal life, you may think how that medium life has no relation to the messages she or he conveys, yet when in trance, that medium conveys profound messages. So, the level of maturity of a medium is displayed the degree of his or her identification with the messages conveyed. Because, as we read last week, the mental and emotional imagery and or the egoistical desires of a medium may mix with the messages to be conveyed. That is why the importance of the controller of such communications. Let's start reading from the point where we stopped last week. And again, because this passage is a long one, I will pause and then we can discuss the part we read before reading other parts. For the automatic communication to be understood well, we see it as useful to summarily repeat its mechanism. Every vibration arriving at the brain must certainly be reflected to the consciousness center either directly or via other channels. 4. Because the being is connected to the human body via the consciousness center, the center governing the brain, nervous system and consequently the whole body is the consciousness center. Therefore, without its approval, nothing can be done in the organism. Otherwise, that is, if every incoming influence attempts to use the centers directly, without appealing to the consciousness, this situation not only attacks against the freedom of the being but also disturbs the wholeness of the organism, and a situation emerges such as disintegration of this wholeness, which is not in accordance with the necessities and the order is disturbed. There is no power mighty enough in universe to disturb the divine order. Therefore, every external influence that wishes to do this or that activity must definitely act without disturbing the wholeness of the organism. For this, every influence entering there must go through the approval of the consciousness. So, influences sent from outside and executed by the organism, whether comprehended or not, must definitely go through the approval of the consciousness center. However, influences arriving at mediums at high, average and low levels, although they are reflected to the consciousness, are sometimes not of a quality to activate the comprehension molecules belonging to the meanings they carry, as we have said, in the consciousness. Influences of this character end up only having the related centers to do necessary deeds via the consciousness center, without human comprehension involved. That is, the consciousness center, without human comprehension involved, gives positive or negative commands to the required execution centers about the putting into effect of that deed, under the influences arriving at it. Those centers, according to this command, reflect the influences that are arriving at them from above and that have acquired their meanings by going through various channels to the surroundings by translating them into their communiqué tools. And this happens as such, as we said above. Consciousness is 7/8 of the being which is connected to the brain. Therefore, consciousness is also contained within the whole of the being. It only occupies the molecule ensembles in a certain part of the brain cells pertaining to human life. These molecules exist in groups. As some of these groups constitute human comprehension, some other parts do the deeds belonging to the conduction of the brain centers according to commands from the being. Therefore, the comprehension mentioned here only belongs to the human brain, or more correctly, a comprehension belonging to the human. This should not be mistaken for the comprehension occurring in the essence being. So, comprehension not occurring in the comprehension cells of the consciousness center does not mean that influences arriving at the consciousness center will not be comprehended in the essence being either. Because of this, an event which is automatic, which remains unknown by the comprehension molecules in the consciousness center and consequently by mankind, has been comprehended by the essence being. Such is the automatic character. Influences from outside arriving at the brain and waiting certainly for the commands of the consciousness center in order to be executed by the executing centers either interest or do not interest the comprehension cells of the molecule groups, constituting the consciousness center, and this depends on necessities. If they interest them, consciousness center does its activity upon other centers with comprehension, that is, it knows the deeds it does while it is in its human state. If the incoming influences do not interest the comprehension molecules, consciousness center renders its administrator duty as usual, but its human state is not aware of the deeds it does. Whereas higher consciousness of the being is aware of those deeds with its own comprehension and it governs the consciousness center with this comprehension of its. So, here, from another angle we fortify the meaning of the knowledge we previously gave about that human comprehension is not same with the comprehension of the essence being.
Yes, this passage strengthens the points explained in the previous passages we read in the last 2 weeks. And also, emphasizes the issue of comprehension more strongly because Even if the influences sent to the medium are not comprehended by the consciousness center, hence the automatic, but those influences can be comprehended by the essence being. And we should not think this significant mechanism as only valid for the mediums. No, it works in our daily lives for all human beings. Our brain has a main function called consciousness that allows us a constant connection without being. Influences coming from our being, from higher consciousness or superconsciousness, are received by our consciousness. And this function has some regions in our brains, and these regions have cells and molecules. And we read in this book that the molecules making up our consciousness has also different functions. Some of these are for comprehending, for noticing, and some of these are for governing the other centers of our body. And, as influences incoming from the being, these activate or don't activate some vibrations in the consciousness, on these parts with comprehending and noticing functions. So, in a spiritual communiqué, if the being or the plan wants the medium to be aware of this, those vibrations are activated on those parts of the consciousness. In turn, these vibrations activated other related centers. That is, if the medium will convey the message by speaking, then the centers regarding speech will get activated. That is, if the medium will comprehend the content of the message she or he conveys, both these molecules and the other centers gets activated. I am sure our dear friends understood this very well. Yet the most important point here in this passage is that even if the medium does not comprehend the content, his or her essence being or higher self may comprehend it. So, the scope of the comprehension at that higher level we call the being is greater. Yet when I say this, I think many of our dear friends will say, but the main part of the being's energy is connected to our body. Then how is this possible? Alright, the divine order and the universe give such a ratio for us so we can understand it better. However, with worldly comprehension of ratios, we may get this wrong. Yes, 7 parts of the being's energy is here, concentrated to this brain and body, and 1 part of the being's energy is at that perceptual point of comprehension. Yet, that 1 part is within the spherical time system, within a spherical awareness, so that 1 part is within the much wider and more encompassing connections. That is, this 1 part receives, interprets the influences from our plan, from other beings, restores the essential knowledge gleaned from the accountings done at the spatium after each lifetime. Therefore, the capacity of comprehension in that 1 part of our being's energy ensemble should be beyond our ordinary consciousness.
Yes, this fact is emphasized in this book many times. In this body, in this human structure within this hydrogen cosmos, and limited with the brain and nervous system of this human body, no matter how wide our perceptions are, we can never be within a state of complete comprehension. The levels of comprehension we can achieve are automatic, semi-comprehending and at best, more or less comprehending. And such total comprehension can only be possible at the plan of duty. I wanted to repeat this point while we talk about comprehension. In this passage, the book explains how the parts of the comprehension work in the mediumistic processes. And again, the most important point is, as you said, the essence being is aware of the influences sent to us, and also the influences sent from us, even if our daily consciousness and worldly comprehension are unaware of these influences we received or sent out. That relatively free part of our being is completely different than our worldly masks, roles, personalities, all our parts that belong to the plots of scenarios of the world events. And all impressions and experiences we can gain from all of these is accumulated at that perceptual point of comprehension we call as the being. And the book once again underlines the importance of the communication between brain, the nervous system and the intercommunication and integrity of all the centers of the body.
And let me mention a few more things about the comprehension, because this is connected with all other topics and concepts we discuss. Yes, the comprehension of our being is different than the comprehension by the consciousness belonging to our consciousness bound to the world, is different. And, yes, our being is built out of high-level energy and matter, and even the sublime concepts such as love, conscience, comprehension are ever subtler versions of matter. This book explains this fact to us again and again. But still, there is an immense difference between the matter vibrations we humans experience here and the vibrations of the level the being exists at. Because of this, when you read or hear us saying everything is but matter, please do not visualize that matter as similar to world matter. So please be careful as you think about matter. And we had read in the earlier spiritual communiques, there are such material structures in the universe that you think them as spirit, and the strongest example to this is our being. Previously, we were naming it as spirit.
And then, we learned that spirits are super-universe truths. This book places spirits beyond our matter universe. You can watch our previous videos to learn about all those passages and commentary on the being, on the relation between spirit and being. Yes, let's continue reading. There are various reasons for the bestowing of automatic communiques. For example, a sublime being wants to hide from the medium some of the meanings of the communique it wishes to convey. Therefore, it sends its influences to the consciousness center without touching the comprehension cells in the consciousness center. Then, the consciousness center approves it automatically, without knowing its meaning, and commands the center for speaking to act accordingly. It should be remembered that impressions in the consciousness actually comes from knowledge in the unconscious. However, because the consciousness is always in connection with the unconscious, especially in the trance state, not evoking impressions in the consciousness means that the knowledge to be consigned from the unconscious to centers has not activated the quantitative values of the consciousness up to a degree to cause its awakening. If these values are sent to the comprehension molecules in the consciousness to a sufficient degree, through the motions occurred in it, impressions begin to be evoked and the consciousness begins to act with comprehension. Likewise, as happens in some backward communications, regardless of the state of the being, a simple being, as completely free of the condition of whether these impressions are evoked or not in the consciousness center, also acts automatically and only expects the consciousness to put into effect the required influence in the centers. Therefore, impressions belonging to the meanings expressed by those influences are again not evoked in the consciousness, and the consciousness acts automatically. Sometimes, the nature of the medium and state of the consciousness center are not suitable for impressions to be evoked in the consciousness center by incoming influences. The consciousness center commands the related centers upon only the impression evoked in the consciousness about the execution of the required deed. It has them to do these deeds. And sometimes, incoming influences are not in a state to evoke these impressions. In short, because of various similar reasons, without evoking impressions belonging to the meanings of the incoming influences in the consciousness center works only with impressions about the execution of those. In that case, the character of automatic mediumship emerges. We repeat that all of these situations occur under the control of sublime beings and in accordance with sublime necessities and imperatives. There is nothing arbitrary and random at all.
In this passage, what we have previously discussed is emphasized again. The reasons for the automatic communication are listed. There may be many reasons for this kind of spiritual communiques and communications.
Yes, as stated here. Sometimes, the nature of the medium and state of the consciousness center are not suitable for impressions to be evoked in the consciousness center by incoming influences.
And about the brain's automatic governing a certain center, best example is driving an automobile. When we have to go somewhere, we have an intention and a destination. Let's say this is the influence incoming to our system from our being. Yet when we enter our car and turn the ignition key, we are not much aware of the mechanical process of driving. Like I am now easing off the accelerator, I am now pushing the clutch all the way in. I am now selecting the next gear, etc. And now the gear I select is changing the speed and torque of the tires, etc., etc. I mean, we do not think about the mechanism at all. We start our car and drive in an automatic state. Similarly, how our brain governs all centers engaged in driving without evoking a thought about the process. Here as well, our brain governs the centers without activating any awareness.
In other words, this is bypassing the awareness, and this may be accelerating and harmonizing the communication process. The striking point here is the example of backward communications, as we read. As happens in some backward communications, regardless of the state of the being, a simple being also acts automatically. And in the divine order and the universe, it is stated many times that all of these situations occur under the control of sublime beings and in accordance with sublime necessities and imperatives. There is nothing arbitrary and random at all. That is, even an incoming influence coming from a backward or simple being and arriving at the magnetic field of a human may be due to a need for test and trial. And it may be a need for test and trial for the medium, as well as, or rather, for the other receivers that seek, listen to or read such messages. In this sense, I'd like to emphasize the need for discernment as we seek, read, or listen to various kinds of spiritual communiques, channelings, etc. After reading these passages we read last and this week, I am sure it is obvious that in automatic communications, there may be messages warped and twisted because of many reasons. So, the best test is to see if what we learn from such messages can be applied or not to our own life, to our own relationships. Yes, what we read or listen to in such messages may be bizarre, sensational, baffling, exciting, ego-flattering, etc., but the real test of their efficacy is if they turn out to be beneficial in our spiritual development.
Of course, this is a question of the need on the part of the human being. I mean, not every human being needs to be fed in the same way. So, yes, as you said, each of us must be aware if such spiritual messages overlap with our own needs or not. As the simile of foods, we must be aware if those messages are nutritional, fulfilling or not. Because we need to spend efforts in the directions of feeding ourselves with better food, because bad eating may become a habit as well. So yes, each of us has to study our own inner world and our true needs.
Do you remember the spiritual messages of Silver Birch? I was very young when I learnt about the Metapsychical Society, and when I read the books of Silver Birch the Society published. This was such a smooth and nice introduction for me to the spiritual topics. Because those spiritual messages from Silver Birch were touching my heart, orienting me to love while teaching the fundamental facts of the spiritual knowledge. And because these were what I need at that time of my life, and because these were proper messages, later it was easier for me to build my further spiritual education up on this proper ground. In this sense, I'd like to tell our dear friends to be careful about the spiritual messages they seek to know, read, and listen to. Now, you know the mechanisms so you can filter all messages through your reason and comprehension. We even say that don't take everything we tell you as fixed information as we read and comment on the pages we read together. Because we comment within our current capacity of comprehension, current scope of our understanding. It may be that 10 years later we will discover such new things that we will tell and comment in completely different ways. So, we will use our reason and comprehension all the time to track our developmental progress, so can we have a balanced system for evaluation.
And of course, here we don't judge spiritual messages by saying this one is good, that one is not so good. As you said, we simply say that everyone needs to evaluate such messages by his or her own reason and intuition. Our friends are asking at the chat box that if this or that channeling is good or not. So let us repeat again to make what we want to convey to you clearer. What you call as channeling is also a type of mediumship, and the most important issue is, as we read in this passage, you need to know that if this communication is controlled or not, if something leaked from the unconscious of the channel into the message or not.
And I'd like to emphasize another point, as well. Every channeled message is not necessarily correct just because it is a channeled message. I mean, not every spiritual communiqué comes by the same mechanism or from the same level. Let's continue reading, and what we will read will give us more information about those different levels of beings. Now, let us take the obsession mechanism, which is the crudest of the communications. Here also the technique is similar to the previous ones. However, here, as the necessity of the character of a backward communication, during the communication, freedom of the being who is obsessed has been abolished, in quantities less and more in accordance with the degree of obsession's intensity. Even, in some intense degrees of obsession, man enters into a state of not knowing himself anymore. He becomes a toy in the hand of a simple being that is called an obsessor. Obsession occurs under such a mechanism. First of all, the being that will obsess should be quite backward and closest to the dense layers of humanity of the world. Because of countless reasons such as evolution, increase of refining experiences of a man, his going through the knowledge of comparison, a simple being with a very narrow comprehension, excess desires, thoroughly selfish starts to send its crude influences to the higher consciousness of a man by the approval and consent of sublime necessities. For this, as we previously said, there is neither a possibility nor a necessity for it to pass through transformer milieus. It sends its influence directly to the higher consciousness. At first, it does not prevail over the higher consciousness. However, its crude and dense influence, when passed to the field of consciousness from the higher consciousness via the channel of unconscious, occupies that field. And then, it completely prevails over the consciousness. When this prevalence advances a little bit more, it goes up to the higher consciousness and eventually, the obsessor being covers the whole field of higher consciousness and takes it over. Then, influences coming from the essence being of man cease almost completely, and instead of the essence being, influences begin to come from the obsessor being. In this way, because of the lessened relation with the higher consciousness, consciousness turns towards the subconscious. It starts to receive all commands from the obsessor which has taken over the higher consciousness. And because the obsessor occupies the whole field of higher consciousness at that moment, the man who is obsessed starts to comprehend the obsessor as his own being. The obsessor, starting to influence the consciousness center in this way, connects the consciousness center to the subconscious as well. This is a situation similar to the dreams that occur with influences coming from the surroundings, whose mechanism we previously talked about. That is, the obsessed man begins to live a peculiar life constituted out of the irrelevant and disconnected imaginations taken randomly from the knowledge of his subconscious by the obsessing being in accordance with its whims. And he sees himself in the identity of another being. This means that consciousness is only face-to-face with images constituted in the subconscious, as well as the influences coming from the higher consciousness which are of the obsessor and filled with desirous, ignorant and selfish meanings suitable to its simple nature, and the obsessed man loses his own identity within these confused states, that is, he feels himself in other states. In the meantime, because the obsessor has been using both the consciousness and subconscious of that man as it wishes, it gathers these images according to its whims and capacity, and brings about the impressions in the consciousness that are suitable to its inclinations. Here, because the consciousness center takes the impressions all the time from the obsessor, its perceptual identity comes as well via the channel of the obsessor. Therefore, man sees everything from the viewpoint of the obsessor and cannot have a comprehension pertaining to his own being. If the obsessor does not reflect these impressions to his consciousness at all, then he does not know anything and acts as an automat. Nevertheless, through the mechanism we talked about above, he leaves his will completely to the obsessor, and the obsessor uses and directs his consciousness as it wishes, without reflecting anything to his comprehension.
This is about a very heavy case of obsession. Yes. And we heard and learnt about such obsession cases from our teachers, our elders at the society. Back then, the technical term they used was subjugation, the total domination or control of a human body by another being, but of course, there are levels and layers of this control. At one of the obsession cases Master Erikdal told us, the obsessor being was making the human being obsessed bark like a dog. Or there were cases the obsessors were giving the obsessed persons absurd instructions. So, from small digressions from their usual personality traits, to heavy cases where obsessed persons have no comprehension left related to their self, there are many layers to this. And there are very sad examples of these were seen in some cults where followers of the cult committed mass suicide. All of these are cases of obsession, where the incoming influences from an obsessor, that is, from a simple or backward being, have very low-level vibrations. And the level of vibrations of the person or persons that will be obsessed are very similar to the vibrations of the obsessor being. Then the connection is made easily because the vibrational levels of the obsessor and the obsessed are close. Then there is no need for transformer stations to reduce the intensity of the incoming influences. Still, the most important knowledge is that these cases occur if there is such a developmentary need for the persons involved. These happen under the control of the divine order, if the persons will gain some certain observations, impressions, and consequently, will provide opportunities for some certain observations, impressions to the other persons around them. Such cases happen under the agreement of the all beings involved. Some cases last a lifetime, some cases happen for a short period of time, and then stop completely.
And in some cases, change in person's voice is observed, or, if the obsessor being's influence is of male quality and the obsessed person is a female, her body may grow more hairs, display hormonal changes, etc. As you said, such changes depend on the degree of the obsession, and when the obsessor being is in total control of the person, this is called possession or subjugation, and the whole mechanism of consciousness of such a person is under the influence of such a being. And such beings are simple and backward, in the sense that the main part of their energy is still earthbound, mostly due to their unfinished business left from their life plans. Let's say, an alcoholic dies and leaves his or her body, yet the addiction's hold on the energy of the deceased person is so strong that this desire for consuming more alcohol may send vibrations to a living person who drinks socially but has a similar tendency for consuming more. Such a matching may lead to cases of obsession. And now we know that that kind of matching is not in vain or arbitrary, this is a two-sided occurrence. If some influence arrives at us and holds on, then this means that there is something similar or suitable in us to keep that influence, like a hook. In the final analysis of such cases, the most important issue is to become aware of that hook. What kind of emotion or feeling is that? Is it because of a belief, of a trauma? As we read here, because of countless reasons such as evolution, increase of refining experiences of a man, his going through the knowledge of comparison. And the clue we can find here is to increase refining experiences by ourself, starting from the physical food we eat and drink to the vibrational food we take in by the impressions from the places, people, interests, etc., etc. There is a question to you, dear Gültekin. Can obsession happen even if we are not aware of this?
Well, we may be unaware, but such a being is aware of the decrease in our vibrational integrity. You may say that we talk about a being, a deceased being, a being without a body, so its scope of vibrational action may have more possibilities. But still, without the influences coming from such a simple or backward being, we humans can influence each other in such extreme degrees that our focused energies over another person maybe act as an obsession. Unrequited love or unwanted affection, desires and passions can become easily unhealthy, especially if we become prisoners of our own emotional and mental imagery in our unconscious. So, please don't think that an obsessor being does the whole job. No, obsessed person does the half of the job. And just think about the ideological fixations of humans, or emotional fixations we may observe in our daily life or as we watch and hear the news.
Let's continue reading. Now, we will also say a few things about the scheme of influence that a hypnotist uses on his subject, and which is more or less fitting to the obsession mechanism. No matter how powerful a man is, as long as he is within the narrow possibilities of his body, he cannot directly govern the higher consciousness of a man, unlike an obsessor on the outside who is in a more or less free state. However, without knowing its mechanism, hypnotists stop the connection of the unconscious to the higher consciousness of the subject by the influences they send out in various ways. When the influences that are supposed to come from the higher consciousness cease, hypnotists start to send their own influences to the consciousness. Here, foreign influences, unlike an obsession, do not arrive from the higher consciousness but directly from hypnotists to the consciousness via the channel of the unconscious. As you see, there is not much difference between two of these in regard to the technique. Once this mechanism is established, the subject begins to act with the influences of the hypnotist. If the hypnotists do not send influences to evoke impressions on the subject's field of consciousness, then he acts automatically, completely without comprehension. Nevertheless, since these influences, that is, the meanings and the suggestions of the hypnotists already exist in the unconscious, these meanings or impressions can be reflected to the consciousness, when necessary.
Yes, in this passage, the book explains the mechanism of hypnosis, as utilizing the same process as in the obsessions. However, in hypnotism, there are two persons, instead of a disembodied being and a living person, and two living persons cannot directly govern the higher consciousness of each other. However, a hypnotist is a person with a strong magnetic field, so a hypnotist, even though unaware of this mechanism we discuss, a hypnotist can use magnetism to cut the connection another person's higher consciousness, and then, it may be possible to contact that person's consciousness, and to send influences and suggestions. Because the hypnotic state is similar to sleep, that is, influences from the body centers are silenced. Let's remember what happens during sleep. Because our daily consciousness is inactive during sleep, our consciousness center is directed towards our unconscious, and to the higher conscious or superconsciousness, and we convey some certain impressions and influences from our unconscious to our being. So, in this sleep-like hypnotic state, if a hypnotist sends some influences to the unconscious of a person, she or he can have possibility of interfering with the centers of the consciousness of that person, and the hypnotist uses the images already exists in that person's unconscious.
Of course, the hypnotic level mentioned in this passage, and also mentioned by Mr. Ruhselman in his earlier work, is deeper than the usual hypnotic levels. Such depth of hypnosis is possible only for the 1 or 2% of general population. We read in this passage that in hypnosis foreign influences comes directly from hypnotist to the person's consciousness via the channel of the unconscious. Once this mechanism is established, that person begins to act with the influences of the hypnotist. Let's say you want to quit smoking and hypnosis helped you to quit. Still, if you don't discover and work on the root causes of this nicotine addiction, it may surface as a relapse or another addiction in your life. And it is important that such work is to be done by the experts. If we will open our unconscious for suggestions to be made by a hypnotist, we must be careful about the background and the earlier work done by them.
And Mr. Ruhselman, although he was very interested in hypnosis in his young age, later he utilized another method, a kind of semi-relaxed state of consciousness.
Yes, the method of disassociation. In that altered state of consciousness, the person is aware of the process, both as an observer and also as a conveyor. I see your questions and comments in the chat box, dear friends, and many of you write that this topic of obsession and possession is so scary. First of all, please remember that such heavy cases are rare, but the most important point to remember for all of us is this: all kinds of possibilities for the evolution and development of a being are brought out by the divine system, within unfailing orders and mechanisms. Yes, in the past, even we consider such heavy cases as scary, yet, as our understanding of being widens, our perspective regarding such cases widens as well, because the compassion toward to all beings widens within us. This is indeed a reciprocative learning process for all beings at every level. We advance together as we advance each other. Yes, this is, for the time being, our last video with you, dear Gültekin. Thank you so much for your comment. Good evening, dear friends. Hoping to see you next week.
Thank you for inviting me as a commentator. And dear friends, please keep on watching our weekly videos.